In Rome, the gods were not in the sky. They were in the streets, in the oaths of soldiers, on the thresholds of homes, and in the fate of emperors. Paganism in the Roman Empire was not a single belief, but a hidden network of gods that sustained power itself. In this video, we will uncover the sacred world that truly ruled Rome. To travel anywhere within the Roman Empire, even briefly, was to encounter an overwhelming diversity of beliefs. Religion was not a single structure, but a dense landscape of overlapping traditions, gods, and rituals. A typical Roman city, if such a model could truly exist, would have required space for an extraordinary range of cults. Temples would stand not only for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, but also for Mercury, Apollo, Mars, Venus, and Ceres. Alongside them appeared foreign gods, brought from distant regions, Egyptian deities like Isis and Serapis, Eastern figures such as Mithras, and countless others absorbed into local worship. This was not an exception but the norm across Italy and far beyond. Even in remote and isolated regions, the pattern was the same. In quiet alpine valleys, far from imperial centres, inscriptions reveal altars dedicated to a long list of divine names. Some were familiar Roman gods, others came from the Greek world, Egypt, Persia, or local traditions that predated Roman rule. Often, only a single native god remained among many imported ones. The religious world of the empire was not neatly organised by geography or ethnicity. It was layered, cumulative, and constantly expanding. In cities of the eastern provinces, the mixture was even richer. Greek and Roman gods were worshipped side by side, sometimes identified as equivalents, sometimes treated as distinct powers. Local deities with regional importance stood alongside pan-imperial figures. Coins, inscriptions, and public monuments reveal cities honouring dozens of gods at once. Some cities publicly acknowledged 40 or more divine figures, drawing from Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Greece, and Rome alike. Religious identity was not exclusive, it was additive. Writers of the period were keenly aware of this crowded divine world. Satirists imagined gatherings of gods from every corner of the known world, all sharing the same heavenly space. Historians and Christian authors later listed regional cults, province by province, showing how each land maintained its own sacred traditions. Arabia, Egypt, the Balkans and Asia Minor each preserved distinctive religious landscapes, even while belonging to the same empire. The sheer number of gods was not the result of an obsession with inventing new powers, but the natural outcome of an empire built from many peoples, each bringing their own inherited beliefs. As political power expanded and smaller states were absorbed into larger ones, religious systems followed the same path. Gods were not eliminated but gathered together, just as populations were. Over time, this process produced vast imperial structures that drew strength from diversity rather than uniformity. By the height of Roman rule, this process was complete. The empire presented itself as tolerant, both on earth and in the heavens. This tolerance was not absolute. Certain groups faced restrictions at various times. Jews and Christians periodically came under pressure, and older priestly traditions, such as those of the Druids, were eventually suppressed. Practices like human sacrifice were banned, and later laws prohibited bodily mutilation, even when performed for religious reasons. These measures, however, were generally justified as moral or social concerns, rather than attacks on belief itself. Even laws targeting divination were motivated more by fear of unrest than by opposition to religion. In principle, the empire allowed people to follow the customs of their ancestors. Yet tolerance was only one side of the story. Equally powerful was the conviction that neglecting the gods was dangerous and wrong. Religious duty was understood in collective terms. To honour only one god while rejecting all others was seen not as devotion but as denial. This is why monotheists were often accused of impiety. From the Roman perspective, refusing to acknowledge the shared religious world amounted to rejecting the moral order itself. Across the empire, there was a deeply rooted belief that religious traditions must be preserved exactly as they had been received. Respectability, decency, and social trust all depended on maintaining inherited rights. This expectation applied not only within one's own community, but also across cultural boundaries. A person could worship different gods from their neighbours and still be respected, as long as those gods were ancestral and long established. For this reason, even groups viewed with suspicion could sometimes defend themselves by appealing to tradition. Jews, for example, were often excused on the grounds that they faithfully maintained ancient customs, even if those customs were considered mistaken. Christians, however, faced greater hostility because they were seen as abandoning an ancestral tradition rather than preserving one. They were accused of desertion, not merely difference. In response, Christian writers argued that reason and philosophy should outweigh tradition, directly challenging the values that underpinned religious tolerance itself. These debates reveal a shared foundation beneath religious conflict. Across both the Greek and Latin-speaking worlds, people believed that age itself carried authority. What had lasted longest was assumed to be closest to truth. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. New beliefs were unsettling, even dangerous. Old customs, by contrast, were trusted precisely because they had endured. This attitude shaped public arguments as well as private feelings. Christian authors repeatedly emphasized the antiquity of their sacred history, striving to prove that their moral ideas predated Greek philosophy and epic poetry. They understood that age was persuasive. To be ancient was to be legitimate. This logic was not uniquely Christian, it was widely shared. Even critics of traditional religion accepted the principle that longevity implied value. Behind this reverence for tradition lay powerful emotional bonds. Honouring the gods was also a way of honouring parents and grandparents. To abandon ancestral worship was felt as a betrayal of family, as much as of the divine. Religious conservatism was rooted not only in fear or habit, but in affection and loyalty. Faith was inherited like memory, bound to personal identity and communal continuity. In everyday religious language, gods were often described as ancestral in two distinct ways. Sometimes the term expressed intimacy and protection, referring to the deity who watched over a household or a city, acting as guardian and patron. More often, however, it carried the pain of distance. For people living far from their homeland, ancestral gods represented belonging. Letters and inscriptions left by migrant communities reveal a longing to preserve familiar rites in foreign lands. Maintaining traditional worship became a way of resisting isolation and remembering who they were. Across the Roman world, religion functioned less as a system of belief than as a network of inherited obligations. It was shaped by memory, place, and continuity rather than doctrine. In such a world, diversity was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed. The gods multiplied because the empire itself was made of many pasts, layered together and preserved through time. Loyalty to local gods in the Roman world sometimes appeared in a very personal and public form. One of the clearest examples came during prayers offered for the emperor and his family. In such prayers, people did not simply ask for the ruler's well-being in general terms. Instead, they addressed their own ancestral deity directly, asking that local god to protect the emperor. The message was subtle but powerful. Imperial authority was acknowledged, yet it was placed under the care of the community's traditional divine guardian. Emperors responded in kind. When they travelled through the provinces, they regularly honoured local gods rather than imposing a single imperial cult everywhere they went. They made offerings, dedicated precious objects, or performed sacrifices at regional sanctuaries. One emperor climbed a mountain shrine to honour a local form of Zeus. Another paid tribute to the paired gods worshipped in Palmyra. Others sacrificed to healing gods, sun gods, or regional protectors, and these acts were sometimes commemorated on coins or inscriptions. From Asia Minor to the Danube frontier, from Italy to the eastern deserts, emperors demonstrated respect for the sacred traditions of each place they visited. What stands out is how evenly this respect was distributed. Emperors did not limit their gestures to the most famous gods of the classical pantheon. They also acknowledged deities known only within a narrow region. Some gods were tied so closely to a city or landscape that they shared its name. Others were worshipped only along a river, in a valley, or among a specific people. These local gods rarely appear in stories or myths, and they left little trace beyond inscriptions and altars. Yet, they were treated as fully legitimate members of the empire's religious world. A step higher in visibility were local gods whose names became attached to more familiar divine figures. A well-known god might appear with a regional title, signalling that beneath the famous name lay a distinctly local tradition. These were not replacements but overlays. The outward label was Greek or Roman, but the cult beneath often remained unchanged from earlier times, surviving conquest with its identity intact. In the eastern provinces, this process most often gathered around Zeus. Dozens of local versions flourished, each rooted in a specific place and tradition. In the western provinces, Mars played a similar role. These combinations created the appearance of a unified imperial pantheon, but the unity was largely superficial. What looked like one god across the empire was, in reality, hundreds of separate cults, sharing a name while retaining their own rituals, meanings, and histories. Ancient writers themselves make clear just how fragmented this religious landscape remained. Lists of gods drawn from different regions show that many deities existed entirely outside the classical Greco-Roman framework. Different peoples continue to honour their own traditional gods, whether tied to agriculture, healing, war, fertility, or the land itself. North Africa, Syria, Arabia, Gaul, and Asia Minor all preserved distinctive religious identities, even while participating in imperial life. Some authors offered long catalogues of regional gods, emphasizing how each people worshipped its own divine patrons. Others focused on which gods the state officially recognized for legal purposes, such as receiving bequests. These lists often favored widely known names and excluded obscure or foreign ones. What mattered was not the total number of gods worshipped, but which were considered familiar enough to be acknowledged by official institutions. Modern historians have tried to impose order on this complexity by turning to inscriptions. Hundreds of thousands survive, and many record acts of worship. From them, it is possible to estimate which gods were mentioned most often in different regions. The results suggest a small group of highly prominent deities standing above a vast and disordered mass. Jupiter dominates almost everywhere, with regional variations in emphasis. Other gods follow in shifting patterns depending on geography. These figures, however, must be treated cautiously. Some gods appear under Roman names while concealing older local identities. Others seem more important than they truly were because certain sites produced unusually large numbers of inscriptions, such as military camps or administrative centres. In some regions, the absence of major ports distorts the picture by underrepresenting foreign cults. What the data shows is not a clean hierarchy, but a rough outline shaped by chance survival, as much as by religious reality. Despite these limits, one conclusion is clear. The worship of Jupiter, far from being empty ritual, held genuine importance across both public and private life. Even in cities known for domestic cults and household devotion, Jupiter retained a strong presence. This contradicts the idea that supreme gods were honoured only out of habit or political obligation. In the Greek-speaking East, inscriptions are harder to use for comparison, but the pattern broadly aligns with the West. Zeus stands far above the rest. Below him come familiar Olympian gods, followed by healing, fortune, and mother deities. What differs is the reduced prominence of Eastern mystery gods, which never achieved the same visibility there as in frontier regions of the West. Taken together, the evidence suggests a religious pyramid. At the top stood one supreme god. Beneath him clustered a small group of widely recognized deities. Below them spread an enormous and largely unstructured mass of local gods, many known only within a single community. But there is another way to organize this religious world, one that has nothing to do with geography or divine rank. It can also be arranged according to social class. Roman society itself was sharply hierarchical. A tiny elite occupied the highest positions of power, wealth, and education. Below them stood local elites who governed cities. Beneath these layers stretched the vast majority of the population, people whose names rarely appear in historical narratives and often survive only as fragments on stone. The slope from the masses to the top was steep, and this social structure shaped ways of thinking far beyond politics. Archaeological evidence shows that rich and poor often worshipped together. Offerings found at sanctuaries range from finely crafted objects to simple, expensive ones. This suggests shared ritual spaces and shared practices across class lines. Large festivals drew crowds from every social background, all performing the same rites in honour of the same gods. Yet alongside this unity lies another reality. Literary sources reveal a deep divide in attitudes. Educated elites often spoke with open contempt about the religious ideas of ordinary people. They dismissed the masses as ignorant, superstitious, and incapable of understanding divine matters. Such language appears not only in pagan writings, but also in Christian polemics. Each side accused the other of appealing to the lowest and least educated members of society. These insults were not accidental. Writers assumed that their educated readers would agree with them. The shared assumption was that serious religious thought belonged to the cultivated few, not the crowd. Public speakers adjusted their tone accordingly, avoiding complex ideas when addressing large audiences, convinced that depth would only provoke ridicule. The groups most often mocked were urban labourers, rural peasants, slaves, women, and children. What mattered was not ethnicity or geography, but education. The dividing line ran between the schooled and the unschooled. Education opened access to philosophical reflection and alternative interpretations of tradition. Those who crossed that threshold, regardless of their birth, often began to distance themselves from the beliefs of the majority. Anyone in the Roman Empire who could read was exposed sooner or later to a familiar idea: that there were two layers of knowledge. One was public, meant for everyone. The other was private, reserved for those considered ready, trained, or initiated. Some writers treated this as simple practicality, explaining that ordinary people needed a clearer, shorter version of religious teaching. Others exploited it to create suspense and fear, hinting at hidden truths and secret powers that only a chosen few could access. Either way, the idea matters for one reason above all. Most of what survives in writing comes from a very specific slice of society. These authors were a tiny minority, and many of them believed they were culturally superior to the majority around them. So when they describe how the wider population worshipped, their accounts have to be read with suspicion, and when they describe their own religious thoughts, they may be sincere, but they still cannot represent the whole empire. If we look for written descriptions of day-to-day religious life, the result is surprisingly thin. A few famous texts exist, a few scenes in stories, a few personal reflections, scattered remarks from satirists and historians. But taken together, it can create a misleading impression, as if people barely cared about the competing temples and cults around them. If that were true, the exchange of rituals and gods across the empire would have been weak. Yet the material record proves the opposite. The problem is not that religion was dull, but that the surviving written record is narrow. When educated people spoke about religion in general terms, they often pointed to two great sources of authority: poets and philosophers. Poets preserved the sacred stories and the old myths. Philosophers offered explanations, arguments, and theories about what the gods truly were. In the Greek world, famous poets were treated as ancient witnesses whose age itself gave them power. Their works were so widely known that a single reference could be understood by any literate listener. Philosophers then built entire traditions of interpretation around those poems, producing discussions about theology, sacrifice, divination, and what counted as proper worship. Even those who criticized religion still wrote long attacks on superstition and fraud, proving that religious practice was a subject worth fighting over. For people who did not want heavy theory, there were simpler guides and handbooks that organized rituals, myths, and divine names. In large cities, someone curious could find texts, summaries, and explanations. In smaller towns, a person might rely on what was locally available, or on travelling teachers, or on whatever a temple's own specialist could provide. This educated audience was not large, but it did not live in isolation. Its interests sometimes spilled into public space in surprising ways. Visitors to old Greek cities found guides ready to recite local myths, as if performing a living tradition. In some places, people prepared public readings about particular gods, as if theology were a civic event. In one extraordinary case, a man in a modest inland town arranged for long columns of philosophical and religious writing to be carved across a city wall in huge letters. The text was placed where farmers and traders would pass on market days. The goal was simple: to lift ordinary minds toward bigger questions. Whether it worked is impossible to know, but the attempt itself shows that religious and philosophical ideas could be pushed outward, not kept behind closed doors. Public spaces often carried religious learning in plain view. Temples did not only host sacrifice and prayer, they could also function as places of reading, discussion, and teaching. Libraries existed in major centres, and temples sometimes held collections of texts as well. Public talks could take place inside sacred precincts. Travelers with intellectual curiosity visited famous shrines not just to worship, but to debate. Temple staff included specialists who knew tradition, ritual procedure, and sacred stories, and they could join these discussions. In certain major sanctuaries, the level of learning could be intense, with resident scholars praised for their mastery of ancient writings and their ability to extract meaning from sacred poetry. Ritual itself demanded knowledge. At many shrines, worship was not left to guesswork. Detailed instructions were displayed publicly, so that strangers would not offend the gods. When new cult centres appeared, rules had to be fixed from the start. In some places, older rules were recarved when the stone had worn down, showing that accuracy mattered. Associations connected to a sanctuary enforced behaviour, sometimes banning crude acts that offended the sacred atmosphere. More broadly, visitors often faced strict purity expectations. They were told how to present themselves, what foods to avoid, what forms of contact counted as defiling, and how long they should wait before entering after certain events in life. Some shrines demanded animal sacrifice of specific kinds. Others required only wine or only incense. Local conditions mattered too. Certain sacred groves forbade cutting trees. Sacred waters or fish might be protected. Some places even banned fires near walls or demanded special care around particular buildings. People did not always claim these rules came from human planning. Often, the instructions were presented as divine guidance. Oracles were a common way to ask what the gods wanted, and behind the oracle's voice stood research, interpretation, and learned tradition. Specialists knew which rituals fit which gods, why certain offerings belonged to certain days, how diet and sexual discipline were believed to affect purity, and how different kinds of sacrifice were thought to work. In some cases, it was claimed that the god spoke directly through a chosen mouthpiece, and the words were then carved into stone. In other cases, age itself was treated as proof. If a ritual was ancient enough, people assumed it must have originated from divine teaching long ago. Because of this, sacred knowledge was not hidden in books alone. It was also written on walls, pillars, and public monuments. People could encounter theology while walking through a city. In some towns, a public wall carried a divine answer about the nature of God, describing the divine as self-existing, wise by nature, beyond ordinary naming, present in fire, with humans described as fragments or messengers of that higher reality. Other divine responses spoke about the soul and its fate after death, describing it as bound to the mortal body during life, then freed and lifted into a purer realm afterward. Some sanctuaries collected these responses into archives, and compilations circulated, feeding both pagan theologians and Christian critics who wanted to quote them. Rules for worship were not limited to the Greek East. They are found across the empire. In some Western communities, long inscriptions laid out proper procedures for sacrifice and linked them to Roman models, showing how imperial culture encouraged uniformity. New settlements often tried to reproduce Roman worship in Roman forms, and standard phrases suggest that the same official templates were reused again and again, even if most of the paperwork has vanished. Still, a warning remains necessary. Stone survives by accident. A single inscription can exaggerate the importance of one site, one cult, one community, or one local enthusiasm. Yet even single pieces of evidence can reveal larger patterns if we ask the right question. What kind of society had to exist for someone to carve a massive philosophical text on a city wall? What habits of worship allowed detailed ritual rules to be posted for everyone? What forms of public life made temples places not only of sacrifice, but of debate? These are the questions that turn isolated fragments into a living picture. There was another kind of public religious writing as well, one that did not focus on rules, but on wonder. Some inscriptions were designed to proclaim the mighty deeds of a god, listing signs, miracles, rescues, and displays of power. Such narratives were popular, and professional storytellers could travel with them, captivating ordinary crowds while being mocked by elites. Among the most influential examples were texts celebrating Egyptian gods that spread widely in Greek form and were rewritten repeatedly over centuries, sometimes in prose, sometimes in verse, sometimes carved into stone. One surviving version presents an overwhelming self-portrait of a divine figure, speaking as a power who stands behind civilization itself. The voice claims authority over seasons and time, over the founding of temples and cities, over systems of counting and order. It describes inventions, festivals, music, education, and the shaping of public institutions. It presents itself as present in mountains, seas, and rivers, as a guardian of justice, as a force that visits through dreams and visions, as a power that speaks through oracles and signs in the sky. The god's identity shifts through many titles, taking on different faces across different lands, suggesting that one divine presence can wear many names without losing its core power. The message is designed to astonish the listener. The divine is everywhere, ancient, endlessly adaptable, and intimately involved in human life, from the smallest act of healing to the ordering of whole cities. Across the Roman world, sacred song never disappeared. Some hymns survived for centuries because people kept copying, repeating, and performing them in new places and new eras. Egyptian-style praise songs for Isis circulated in Latin and Greek in different generations, turning up in papyrus texts and in later poetic compositions. Other writers carried what they had learned in famous sanctuaries back to their home provinces and performed it publicly, spreading temple traditions far beyond the city where they first heard them. Even when the original manuscripts vanished, older hymns remained alive through memory, performance, and occasional reinscription on stone. What makes this continuity striking is that certain hymns were treated almost like permanent parts of a sanctuary's daily rhythm. A traveller today can still stand in a museum and read verses carved long ago for a healing god, and imagine the same words being seen by ancient visitors who had travelled there in hope and pain. Some compositions were preserved because they were considered too important to lose. Even when the poetry was not remarkable, people still carved it onto monuments, not only in the Greek-speaking regions where hymn culture was strongest, but across the empire from the far west to the distant frontiers. Over time, the habit of hymn writing became one of the most visible ways ordinary worship gained a voice. Not all sacred poetry was elegant. Collections of devotional hymns often relied on repetitive praise, long strings of divine titles, and rapid lists of powers attributed to the god being addressed. Many of these hymns were built from honorific descriptions rather than storytelling. The purpose was not literature in the modern sense, but recognition and invocation. The god was greeted, identified through lineages and cosmic roles, credited with miracles and authority, and then urgently asked to listen. Because so many occasions demanded formal praise, initiation ceremonies, epidemics, imperial visits, festival parades, and daily services, the demand for verse outstripped artistic talent. In some settings, full hymns were replaced by short shouted formulas or strange rhythmic chants that sounded like coded language meant to impress worshippers with a sense of mystery. Music was not a decoration around worship. It was part of how worship functioned. Different gods carried different musical expectations. The worship of the Great Mother often featured loud reed instruments, with piercing tones that could cut through crowds. Apollo was linked to stringed music. Isis was celebrated with distinctive rattles and other instruments that made her presence audible. Public religious life also absorbed horns and ceremonial sounds, so that sacrifices, processions, and civic celebrations became inseparable from music. Some writers describe this world as if it were perfectly organized, each god receiving the proper sound, though real practice was surely messier. Still, the central point holds. In many places, sacred space was filled with rhythm, chanting, and performance. In certain sanctuaries, hymns were even displayed with musical notation on temple walls, as if to teach visitors the most acceptable melody. This was not limited to famous shrines. It appears both in well-known centres and in obscure regional cults. At times, specialist singers existed, people whose role was to lead or manage sacred music. But such professionals were expensive, and many communities could not afford them. That likely forced flexibility. Some singers served multiple shrines, some were supported by imperial funding, and in many places amateurs carried the tradition. Most often, sacred music was performed by choruses. These groups could be composed of men or women from elite families, but commonly they were made up of boys before their voices changed. They might sing in sizable groups for local festivals. Yet, in certain famous sanctuaries, smaller delegations became the norm. When cities consulted major oracles, it became almost expected that they would return thanks not only with offerings, but with a hymn performed by a trained chorus. In the high age of oracle activity, boy delegations travelled long distances under strict supervision, performed their hymn in obedience to the divine instruction, and then had their names recorded on the walls of the sanctuary alongside adult companions. Sacred performance was not private devotion. It was public identity on display. There was also a bridge between song and theology. The people who organised religious music often worked closely with those who managed doctrine and ritual knowledge. Sometimes the same expert filled both roles. Sacred praise could be delivered not only in verse, but also in ornate spoken form, structured like an act of worship in words. Public culture encouraged this blending. Teachers of rhetoric even gave guidance on how such speeches should be shaped, explaining that a proper sacred address could focus on naming, origin, nature, deeds, powers, or urgent invocation. These techniques could be used in ways that bordered on theatrical display, including invented dreams and dramatic claims of divine messages, delivered to crowds for maximum effect. That detail matters because it points to something larger. If people needed theatres to hear hymns and religious speeches, then enormous crowds must have cared about these performances. The evidence for this is not only in texts, it is carved into landscapes. In the northwestern provinces, archaeology reveals a pattern. Rural sanctuaries with theatres built beside them, sometimes inside the same enclosure. In certain designs, seated spectators had a clear sight line from the stage to the temple front, as if the building itself was meant to fuse performance and worship. What exactly the crowds watched is uncertain, but the arrangement suggests songs, dramatized scenes, ritual displays, or sacred storytelling linked to the local cult. These were not tiny gatherings. In some places where numbers can be estimated, capacity reaches into the thousands, implying major festival events rather than weekly routine. North Africa shows fewer matching structures, but religious performance still existed, often in civic arenas rather than temple theatres. In Romanized cities, shows tied to worship were staged in the same places used for other public spectacles. Processions could begin at shrines and end in large secular venues, where the crowd was already accustomed to gathering. In Italy, such practices were long established and required no special explanation. The form had already become part of Roman civic life. In the eastern provinces, the picture expands and diversifies. Some cult communities built theatres directly into sanctuary terraces, aligning temple and performance space as parts of one sacred route. At certain shrines, holy images were carried out in procession and placed where they could face the gathered crowd, receiving offerings, while the audience watched whatever ceremonies followed. Other sanctuaries arranged stepped seating around their courtyards so that worshippers could observe rituals from shaded porticos. In some towns, a small dedicated theatre served a local shrine, while in others, multiple tiny theatres existed, each linked to a different deity. The size of these structures often suggests that some ceremonies were limited to smaller groups, perhaps reserved for those participating in special rites, though the exact nature of those events is difficult to reconstruct. In the Greek world, initiation sanctuaries also created controlled spaces for sacred performance, with buildings designed to host those permitted to enter. Yet alongside these more exclusive settings stood something else. Massive theatres attached to great healing shrines. Some were built outside cities at the end of sacred roads, designed to handle large festivals and waves of visitors. One sanctuary's theatre could hold several thousand. Another, in a remote location, was built to host crowds on a scale that feels astonishing even now. Tens of thousands during major festival cycles. Ancient visitors themselves were impressed by these numbers, and the architecture confirms that religious life could mobilize entire regions. At the same time, we should not assume that worship was less vibrant, where theatres do not survive. Temporary wooden seating would leave little trace. Rough stone seats could be so irregular that excavators might overlook them. Some communities likely used the city square or borrowed a civic theatre or amphitheatre for sacred events. In some cities, processions ended inside major theatres, where the divine image was ceremonially enthroned, overseeing musical performances, athletic contests, and dramatic exhibitions. In other cases, priests hired performers for extended seasons as part of their public religious duty, turning the city's entertainment calendar into a form of devotion as well. Many sanctuaries, especially in the East, contained architectural features that functioned like seating without being labelled as theatres. Long stairways wrapping around sacred enclosures could accommodate crowds, whether for rites, ceremonies, or festival viewing. Similar arrangements appear in multiple major cult centres, suggesting that performance and public gathering were built into worship even when formal theatres are absent. Crowds of the size these sanctuaries could hold were not gathering to hear abstract lectures about hidden theology. They came for something far more immediate. What pulled people in was a sacred program that looked, from the outside, like a full day of entertainment. Yet every part of it belonged to religion. In some places, the rites were shocking enough to become famous. At Gerasa, for example, a notorious festival drew women out to a holy pool on the edge of town, where they entered the water unclothed in a ritual that was meant to cleanse and transform them. The townspeople watched. The details were rarely explained, but the spectacle was remembered. and it did not happen often, only once every few years. Elsewhere, the drama took different forms. At Patrai, a yearly ceremony turned into a brutal pageant involving wild animals. They were driven in a great hunt, forced toward a sacred enclosure linked to Artemis, and then pushed up a ramp into a blazing fire. Ancient observers describe the scene with astonishment, and it may not have been unique. In communities without traditions so extreme, visitors still found impressive religious shows funded by wealthy patrons who paid to hire professionals. Dance troupes moved from shrine to shrine, selling performances as part of the sacred calendar. Each cult preferred its own style. Some demanded comedic satyrs for Dionysus. Others favoured dancers associated with Eastern rites, performers known for exaggerated movement and provocative costume. The worship of the Great Mother drew its own kind of spinning, pounding dance. Artemis could be honoured with acrobatic footwork. And in Ephesus, armed dancers performed old ritual patterns, meant to recall mythic guardians. The most popular of all were the miming dancers. In Egypt especially, they performed movements alongside the public reading of sacred texts by priests. The result was a kind of blended ritual, as if the hymn itself had been turned into choreography. These were not amateurs. They were skilled professionals, men and women who could become famous across an entire province. Religious critics complained constantly about these performances, and their anger tells us something important. In their eyes, there was little difference between actor and dancer, because the same shows mixed drama, music, and movement into one. They accused performers of staging divine stories in ways that aimed to provoke emotion and desire, using gestures so expressive that the audience could understand a whole plot without a single spoken line. Their complaints described dancers who communicated through the tilt of the head, the intensity of the gaze, the movement of eyebrows, hands, and fingertips. This suggests the audience was trained in the language of gesture, because the repertoire was traditional and repeated often enough for symbolic movements to become instantly recognizable. Every region developed its own sacred style. Some places mourned their gods with laments. Others honoured theirs with large choruses. In certain non-Greek rites, the defining sound was noise, cymbals, drums, and piercing pipes. In parts of the Greek East, ecstatic dance linked to Dionysus became so central that festival time turned whole cities into audiences. People of high status did not hide from it. They took pride in dancing publicly, as if joining the rite proved their cultural standing rather than threatening it. In some sanctuaries, even the act of sacrifice was closely tied to dance, with boy choruses singing, while skilled performers moved in ritual patterns beside the music. This brings us to the smaller performance spaces attached to many sanctuaries. They were not built for ordinary plays. They served what were called mysteries. The word often creates the wrong picture, as if these were secret midnight rites offered only to a tiny inner circle. Sometimes that did exist, but far more commonly, a mystery was a public lesson in a cult, presented in a vivid, memorable way. Large groups could attend. The use of theatres itself proves the point. These were not rooms meant for a handful of sworn devotees. They were built for hundreds and sometimes thousands. Outsiders and hired professionals took part. Children were trained to sing the hymns of revelation. All of this suggests open ceremonies designed to attract as wide an audience as possible, using song, dance, and dramatic presentation to make the teaching unforgettable. So-called foreign rites, especially those associated with Atargatis, Isis, and the Phrygian Great Mother, added another highly visible element. Their devotees often wandered through public streets, looking for crowds. They performed frenzied dances to the scream of pipes and the pounding of drums and rattles, whipping themselves into an ecstatic state, shouting and howling, then extending a begging bowl. The scene was familiar across the empire, appearing again and again in stories, paintings, and everyday memory. If you step back, the pattern becomes clear. Religion did not merely borrow from culture, it absorbed it. Instruments, dance styles, theatrical techniques, spoken praise, moral instruction, philosophical talk, spectacle, and pageantry were all pulled into the service of the gods. If you stripped religious content out of the arts of these centuries, you would remove the core of what people publicly experienced as culture. Yet another truth sits beneath this. The grand programs, the buildings, and the paid performers were usually arranged by the educated and wealthy. They funded the festivals, hired the artists, built the theatres, and sometimes even performed. The ordinary people arrived as the majority, but rarely as the planners. That imbalance reflects the nature of surviving evidence, because the lives of the poor left fewer durable traces. Their gatherings were often temporary, built from reeds, cloth, and improvisation, leaving nothing behind but flattened grass. And yet, those simple celebrations still existed beside the glittering official festivals, each making room for different gods and different kinds of devotion. Cities, especially in the eastern provinces, openly advertised their religious identity. They promoted their signature deities and major festivals to attract visitors. Pride mattered, but so did money. Visitors brought prestige, yet they also brought trade. Even where local coinage was restricted, festivals still functioned as magnets, drawing people from wide regions. The evidence is everywhere, not only in inscriptions but in the physical layout of sanctuaries, where porticos could include shop spaces and where the soil is thick with dropped coins from crowds moving through markets during holy days. In some places, a sanctuary was not just a sacred enclosure, but the heart of the city's commercial life. In major caravan towns, the sacred precinct could double as the central bazaar. In Greece, older markets declined as commerce shifted towards festivals at nearby shrines. Olympia became a symbol of how worship and trade fused, because its gatherings were both religious and economic on a grand scale. Asia Minor shows the phenomenon at its brightest. Wealthy patrons poured enormous sums into festival duties, sometimes saving for years to stage a celebration that would outshine rivals. The larger the crowd, the greater the prestige. But the larger the crowd, the harder it was to control. Festivals attracted every type of person. Some came for faith, some for curiosity, some for games and contests, many for trade. Authorities had to circulate extra money, increase policing, and treat the marketplace as part of the sacred event. Over time, festival leadership could merge with oversight of the market itself, revealing what officials truly worried about. A contemporary description captures the mix perfectly. People arrived for spectacle, competition, and curiosity. Merchants came with goods. Craftsmen displayed their work. Others arrived to show off learning, offering readings from drama, poetry, or prose. Sacred time became a meeting point, where culture, commerce, and belief collided. For many people, these festivals were the only doorway into a wider world. Without missionaries and without mass media, it was not easy to imagine how villagers or the indifferent might learn the names and rites of unfamiliar gods. Most visitors did not travel for theology. Officials came for baths and leisure. Soldiers and administrators passed through for practical reasons. Traders came for profit. Locals arrived to sell, to watch, to drink, to mingle. Yet even without seeking it, they were surrounded by religious messages. They heard shouting and singing filling open streets. They saw dancers and actors reenacting divine stories before enormous audiences. They watched processions surge past, accompanied by instruments as loud as the ancient world could make them. They heard ornate spoken praise performed like public art. They saw sacred images placed in positions of honor, while performances unfolded before them. They witnessed ecstatic devotees spinning and crying out to drums and rattles. And all of this could reach them even if they never entered a temple, never offered incense, never consciously tried to learn anything at all. Religion in the Roman Empire was not confined to private prayer or quiet ritual. It pushed into the public senses. It was loud, visible, and impossible to ignore. Even the least interested person, simply by standing in the wrong place at the right time, could not escape the presence of the gods. Sacred places did not always sit where cities naturally expanded. Many famous shrines stood outside the urban core, sometimes far enough away to demand a deliberate journey. People had to travel out to reach them, walking or riding for hours, sometimes for days. This distance was part of the experience. A sanctuary could feel like a separate world, removed from daily noise, where the rules were different and the divine was closer. Yet it wasn't only people who travelled. In many regions, the gods themselves were made to move. Images of deities left their temples in annual rituals that carried them toward water, toward theatres, or toward neighbouring communities. Isis was among the best known for this kind of sacred journey. In early spring, her image was brought down to the shore in a public rite, connected with ships and the opening of the sailing season. Later in the year, the procession returned again in another ritual cycle tied to the story of Osiris. Other gods were carried to water simply for a ceremonial washing, as if the image needed renewal. Some were taken to public theatres, where crowds gathered and the divine presence was placed in a position of honour to oversee the celebrations. Sometimes the purpose was simpler. A god was carried as if paying a formal visit to allied shrines, reinforcing bonds between neighbouring cults. These processions were carefully staged. The image might ride on a cart drawn by animals chosen for symbolism or prestige. In some traditions, the god travelled in a vehicle pulled by horses, in others by more exotic beasts, at least in representation. Most often, the image was carried on a litter by human bearers, raised above the crowd so everyone could see. And sometimes the procession moved without an image at all. Instead, sacred objects took its place. People carried reeds, branches, boxes, jars, wooden symbols, or the god's clothing and ornaments. Miniature shrines and small replicas could also be carried like portable sanctuaries. The point was not only movement, but meaning. Every object signaled a story, a power or a memory that the crowd would recognize. Sound was essential. Hymns and shrill pipes guided the rhythm of the march. Many processions took place at night, turning streets into rivers of torchlight. Animals being led for sacrifice sometimes bore visible tags announcing who had donated them, turning generosity into public honour. In Greece and Western Asia Minor, these parades were so common that they numbered in the hundreds across the sacred calendar, and in some towns several different processions took place each year for different cults. Beyond that heartland, the custom still appeared widely, especially in cults arriving from the East, even if the details are less familiar to us. The deeper reason to emphasize these public rites is simple. Religious messages were impossible to ignore. Even someone who had no personal interest in gods or rituals was forced to notice them. The streets became a stage. Sound, light, movement, costumes, and symbols demanded attention. Religion did not whisper in corners, it announced itself. But there is an even more important truth. Most people were not indifferent at all. If they had been, we could not explain the long journeys people willingly made to attend sacred celebrations. Pilgrimage was real, and it was widespread. These travellers were different from festival visitors, who came mainly for trade or spectacle. Pilgrims spent money too, but their spending was directed toward offerings. Their wealth, turned into coins and gifts, flowed into shrines from distant regions. Excavations confirm it. Temples received money from far away, proof that visitors were arriving from cities tens and even hundreds of miles distant. To support this movement, many sanctuaries developed lodging. Hostels appeared near sacred centres, sometimes small, sometimes large, designed for visitors who needed to stay not just overnight, but for days or weeks. Long festivals required time. Study and instruction required time. Oracles could involve waiting and repeated consultation. Healing sanctuaries demanded even longer stays because treatment was not instant. People came seeking divine medicine, and many were willing to remain until they believed they had received help. Across the Greek-speaking world, healing shrines multiplied, and the most famous were only the peaks of a much larger system. Theatre size near these sanctuaries hints at the crowds they drew, while inscriptions preserve astonishing travel distances, made by individuals in search of specific springs or famous sacred places. Most pilgrims were men, with women appearing far less often in the surviving evidence. Egypt developed its own pattern because its geography made travel easier. The river functioned like a moving road through the entire country. As a result, paying respects to multiple gods by journey became normal there in a way rarely matched elsewhere. Walls at certain shrines preserve hundreds of visitor messages. Many follow a simple formula, stating that someone arrived to offer prayer on behalf of relatives or specific needs. Some visitors wrote in a more elevated style, describing boats carrying small shrine offerings along the river, arriving from the far south and passing through sacred landscapes that seemed holy by nature. When we see travellers reaching even remote Egyptian sanctuaries from Greece and Italy, it becomes easier to understand why educated readers across the empire could speak with confidence about Egyptian religion. They had either been there themselves or knew someone who had. Pilgrims did not only learn, they carried knowledge home. A traveller who had visited an unusual sanctuary became a storyteller in his own neighbourhood. He described what he saw, how the rituals worked, what the priests said, what the statues looked like, what offerings were demanded, what miracles were claimed. Curiosity spread through conversation. People became familiar with strange gods not only through books, but through neighbours who returned with a head full of impressions. At sanctuaries, pilgrims blended into other streams of visitors. Many were not pilgrims at all, but ordinary tourists, drawn by the fame of a place, the beauty of its buildings, or the thrill of witnessing a ritual. And alongside both groups stood a third category, local specialists. Certain shrines maintained hereditary hosts who guided visitors. Elsewhere, there were official guides and interpreters, people whose role was to explain local myths, sacred objects, and the meaning of rituals. Priests were often quoted in these settings, and so were resident experts who spoke like philosophers, combining learning with personal devotion. Festivals were especially important because they were the moment when the most could be seen and heard, and when the local cult displayed itself at full intensity. Religious debate could erupt in public places. Strangers met in temple precincts and began arguing about symbols, doctrines, and divine meanings. Priests and temple staff joined in. Similar debates could begin in secular spaces too, along a busy shoreline or in a public colonnade, attracting bystanders who listened, shouted, or pressed forward for a better view. Even the question of whether the gods existed could become a public spectacle, argued in front of crowds. The intensity of interest is what matters. Religious curiosity was not limited to any one group. It animated non-Christians and Christians alike, and occasionally they even engaged one another directly. One speaker of the period offered a revealing way to classify how people formed their ideas about the divine. Some beliefs, he said, seemed natural and inborn. Others came from sacred stories and poetry. Others were shaped by public rules and ritual regulations. But he added another source that mattered just as much: art. Paintings, reliefs, statues, and sacred images shaped faith by shaping imagination. People expected to learn what a sanctuary believed by studying its visual world and hearing local experts interpret it. Shrines across the empire were filled with imagery. Walls were painted. Reliefs were coloured. Architectural details were bright, and not bare stone. Some enormous cult statues were gilded, designed to dominate the senses. A masterpiece could seize the mind so completely that anyone who saw it carried its vision forever afterward, unable to imagine the god in any other form. Sanctuaries were meant to overwhelm. They were built to be seen. Inscriptions played their part too. They were often painted to stand out, turning stone into a form of advertising. Authorities repaired and renewed important texts because they were not just information. They were public declarations of belief. Sanctuaries accumulated statues constantly, so many that they sometimes had to remove older ones to make room. New dedications arrived endlessly, commissioned by devotion, by custom, or by fear. Many inscriptions claim a direct reason. A god commanded it. A dream instructed it. A revelation demanded it. People recorded these claims publicly so others would read them and understand that the divine was active, watching, speaking, and intervening. Most people did not dare ignore a divine command. Stories circulated about those who entered a shrine uninvited or violated a ritual boundary and then died soon after. In parts of Lydia and Phrygia, an especially striking pattern appears in surviving records. A person disobeys a local deity, suffers punishment in health, family, or property, learns the reason through a dream or a command, confesses publicly, and then posts a written account on stone as an act of repayment. The purpose was not only confession but warning. The tablet proclaimed the power and the visible presence of the god. The sheer variety of deities involved shows that this was not an isolated practice belonging to one small cult. It was a regional habit spread across a wide area, reflecting a shared belief that gods were not distant ideas but forces that could strike, instruct, demand, and reveal. In that world, sanctuaries were not just buildings. They were engines of experience, places where travel, art, story, sound, punishment, healing, and spectacle combined to make the divine feel unavoidable. Wrongdoing was not punished only when it violated ritual. In many places, moral offences such as theft were believed to trigger divine retribution just as surely as breaking the rules of worship. The harshest consequences were expected when both worlds collided, when someone lied under oath in a sacred setting. False swearing before an altar was treated as a direct challenge to the god's authority, and people insisted that the god answered. In Palmyra, where the local divine guardian was feared and honoured, perjurers were said to meet their penalty. Similar warnings appeared in Mysia near Pergamon and at the healing sanctuary of Epidaurus, where visitors could read public records describing what happened to those who treated the god with contempt. At Epidaurus, the sanctuary made its case in a very direct way. A long series of healing stories was displayed in public view, recounting extraordinary recoveries linked to the god's intervention. Some were old, some were newer, but the point was always the same. The god was active, he saw, he judged, and he healed. One story described a man with crippled hands who came into the sanctuary, saw the posted accounts of cures, and mocked them as nonsense. That night, after he slept, he experienced a vision that silenced his arrogance. Another tale followed a trader who promised the god a portion of his profits, then refused to pay once he had sold his fish. Suddenly, the very goods he carried turned against him, and the message was obvious. A third account told of someone with a stubborn wound who was about to undergo painful treatment elsewhere, only to be warned in a dream to avoid it and travel instead to the god's sanctuary where relief would come. Whether these accounts were 5 years old or centuries old, they were placed where no one could miss them. A curious visitor entering such a shrine would be surrounded by explanations and reminders. Hymns were displayed as public text. Ritual instructions were posted clearly. Lists of divine wonders were set out in simple, forceful language. And if the visitor still had questions, temple interpreters were there, ready to guide him and answer. The environment itself invited reflection. Benches encouraged people to sit, talk, argue, or simply absorb what they were seeing. Painted scenes, carved friezes, rows of dedications, statues with inscribed bases, images sheltered under covered walkways so weather would not destroy them. These healing narratives were designed to persuade. They often sounded like the speech of ordinary people, grounded in names, places, and small details that made the claims feel real. Even skeptical observers noticed the technique. A traveller might admire many of the testimonies yet laugh at a few, but the larger impression was difficult to escape. And this kind of public display was not confined to great sanctuaries. The same methods appeared in out-of-the-way shrines, in Italy and elsewhere, showing that the habit of advertising divine power was not the private property of any one region or any one cult. Accounts of healing and answered prayer were posted across the empire, from Egypt to North Africa to the western provinces. The uneven survival of evidence can mislead us, though. In Greek-speaking areas, long and detailed texts were often carved in stone, while in much of the Latin West, the habit of writing religious matters publicly was weaker and more minimal. Elsewhere, records once existed on materials that rarely survive. Papyrus prayers pinned to statues, wooden panels painted with testimonies, temporary notices displayed for a season and then discarded. Their disappearance tells us nothing about whether the experiences were true. It tells us only that fragile material is easily lost. That loss also creates a social distortion, because the voices most likely to vanish are the voices of the poor and the barely literate. Yet the illiterate worshipper did not need written words to learn religious meaning. Many shrines spoke through images and symbols that required no explanation. Carved ears appeared again and again as offerings, silently declaring that the goddess had listened. Such symbols could be found across the regions we are considering, sometimes carved on stone slabs, sometimes set into walls. In major healing centers, these ear images may even have functioned like focal points for prayer. as if one could speak into them and be heard beyond the human world. Their message was simple and powerful. The god listens, and therefore, prayer is worth speaking. Other offerings spoke just as clearly. Feet carved in stone might mark a person's presence, a sign that the worshipper had come in person to the sacred place. Sometimes they suggested a cure, the restoration of movement. In many sanctuaries, body parts appeared in stone or terracotta, and in some regions even in wood, though those wooden offerings mostly vanished with time. We can still glimpse the lost abundance through older inventories that list objects once displayed inside temples. A leg here, a hand there, masks, breasts, phalluses, snakes, tripods, and countless other items hung from ceilings or set on walls. The surviving fragments, occasionally found in later ruins, hint that temples could resemble crowded cabinets of human anxiety and hope, filled with physical evidence of vows, cures, and gratitude. Shrines were not only places of prayer, they were also places that gathered and displayed the strange, the beautiful, and the memorable. A young man might leave a lock of hair nailed to a wall to mark the end of adolescence, and over time, those offerings could make a surface look almost furred. Elsewhere, visitors might see exotic trophies and curiosities, tusks, skulls, sculpted animals, or even living creatures kept within sacred boundaries. Healing sanctuaries were famous for tame snakes associated with divine medicine, fed carefully by visitors. Some temples kept sacred fish in ponds, creatures that responded to calls and accepted food, sometimes described as adorned with bright ornaments. In parts of Syria, fish were treated as holy, and their sanctity became one more reason people talked about religion. Sacred birds created the same effect. In some cities, certain birds were protected by taboo, and because no one hunted them, they became fearless, living among humans, sharing roofs and even tables. Similar stories appear across different regions. Animals under divine protection, poachers punished, civic authorities intervening to defend a god's creatures, and ancient civic rituals continuing year after year, such as the ceremonial feeding of birds tied to a city's identity. To complete the picture, we also have to imagine sacred spaces as gardens. Groves were not decoration, they were part of the experience of the divine. Shrines held famous trees, rare plantings, and protected woodland. Some cults marked sacred days by cutting a tree from temple-owned woods and carrying it in procession. Priestly groups met in groves for repeated ceremonies. Across the Mediterranean world, thick shade and clustered trees carried a sense of presence, as if the divine was felt most strongly where light was filtered and air was cool. People set groves apart, guarded them, and regulated what could be done within them. And casual references in texts and inscriptions suggest how common this was. These planted sanctuaries also served as social spaces. A famous shrine might include orchards and picnic areas, where people ate and drank beneath heavy shade. Some behaved with restraint, but crowds could also turn such places into full public celebrations. This leads to one of the most practical reasons temples mattered so much. They provided rooms and structures for communal meals, and those meals solved a basic problem of ancient social life. Most homes could not host large gatherings. Even comfortable houses held only a small number of guests. Many people had no suitable dining space at all. Sacred dining areas filled that gap, blending social life with religious practice. Across Italy and the provinces, many sanctuaries were built, with kitchens and banquet rooms. Some cult sites offered a single room. Others had multiple dining chambers, sometimes many, ranging from small spaces for a handful of guests to large halls capable of seating crowds. In the Danube lands and frontier towns, shrines often included monumental entrances and covered walkways leading toward areas designed for feasting. In some regions, certain gods were repeatedly shown in art associated with banquets, suggesting that shared meals were not an occasional extra, but a regular element of worship. In Greece and Asia Minor, the pattern was equally strong. People who were not dedicated followers of a particular god could still join the god's devotees for shared meals within temple grounds, eating sacrificial meat as part of ordinary community life. In major sanctuaries, benefactors funded dining facilities as acts of civic generosity, and the poor could benefit as well, finding food, shelter, or both within sacred space. In Syria, the system could be highly organized. Even small rural shrines might contain multiple dining rooms. In some cities, worshippers formed small religious clubs, each with its own room, meeting and feasting according to a shared plan. In places like Palmyra, long building projects around major temples created communities of workers who formed fraternities, devoted to the gods they served, each group feasting in separate chambers. Invitations were used, meals were prepared by specialists. Entertainment might follow, and the night could end with heavy drinking. The rules posted for these gatherings sometimes reveal what behaviour had become common enough to require prohibition. These customs travelled with people. Migrants and soldiers carried their gods into new provinces and built sanctuaries that included the same dining facilities they knew at home. One particularly widespread cult added banquet rooms to its shrines wherever it spread, sometimes claiming the god himself demanded it. In Egypt, the shared meal was especially well documented. Invitations survive that ask friends to dine at the couch of Serapis, sometimes in a temple, sometimes in private houses or other sacred venues. This suggests that on major holy days, the demand for celebration overflowed the capacity of a single shrine, pushing gatherings into multiple locations. The physical arrangements could be permanent stone rooms, shaded structures over dining couches, or simpler shelters described as tents or mattresses, emphasizing comfort and protection from the sun. A speaker of the period captures the emotional core of these meals by describing Serapis as a divine guest invited to the table, presiding over the gathering like a leader of toasts. This tells us something about the ideal mood people wanted: unity, shared identity, and the feeling that the god was present among them. Yet temple meals also overlapped with secular associations that used sacred spaces for meetings, and shared dining was just as common among groups devoted to other gods, including healing deities and the followers of Mithras. Even outside cult meals, graveside feasts in memory of the dead, were widespread, blending reverence, family duty, and social habit. So what did these meals feel like in practice? The emotional range must have been enormous. In some settings, the sense of the divine presence could be intense, filled with hope, gratitude, fear, or relief. In others, especially during long festival days, the religious meaning could fade behind noise and pleasure. Modern scholars often suspect that intense spiritual emotion was rarer than later religious traditions might assume. At the same time, many signs point to excess. Drinking beyond restraint, reputations for indulgence, stories of vomiting and continuing to eat, scandals that later moralists used as ammunition. Even when those stories are exaggerated, they reflect a social reality in which feasting could slide into disorder. The key point is that judging these gatherings depends on the standard you bring with you. If you import an outside definition of what worship must look like, you will call this all shallow, corrupted, or barely religious at all. But for the people inside that world, meals, music, spectacle, generosity, and even unruly celebration were not necessarily separate from devotion. They were part of how the sacred stayed close to daily life, how belief was experienced in public, and how the gods remained present in the most ordinary human act of all, eating together. From a Christian angle, city-wide religious festivals were often described with open disgust. Writers portray them as celebrations built on false gods, moments when ordinary people supposedly dropped their restraint and surrendered to noise, drinking, and pleasure. Music becomes a symbol of moral collapse in this telling, with pipes, flutes, and loud performances framed as the soundtrack of excess. Yet another voice from the same wider world could interpret the very same scenes differently. A more sympathetic observer insists that the real joy of a holy day is not the sheer volume of wine or the smell of roasting meat, but the shared confidence that the God is near, watching kindly and receiving what people bring. The emotion depends on who is speaking, but the outward reality is easy to picture. Long festivals where food was distributed, processions moved through streets, and song-filled public spaces. In some places, the celebrations stretched over many days, with recurring meals, public hymns, and ritual movement between sanctuary and city. These festivals mattered because they placed religion at the center of ordinary friendship and community life. For most people, having a good time was rarely separate from honoring a divine presence. A god might be treated as the guest of honor at a public meal, the unseen host of gatherings in shaded porticos, or the figure around whom the entire rhythm of leisure was organized. Meat, for countless families, was not an everyday food, and abundant wine was not a daily habit. The occasions that made such things possible were often religious by definition. That reality helps explain why groups who refused participation, especially Jews and Christians who kept their distance from anything touched by the gods, could be branded as unfriendly to society itself. Their counter-argument was blunt and physical. They pointed to the smell, smoke, blood, and mess that clung to sacrifice. They described altars stained with gore, priests working with entrails, and precincts fouled by offal. Even pagan observers sometimes admitted the brutality of the scene. The slaughter, the cutting, the pouring of blood. Since most large-scale butchering was tied to temple sacrifice, sanctuaries could become the main slaughter sites of the ancient city. Many precincts lacked water in the quantities needed for proper cleaning, so waste piled up in corners, flies gathered, and stray dogs prowled. Practical needs followed close behind the ritual: stacks of firewood ready for the altars, storage for hides taken from carcasses, and rules clarifying which parts belonged to the god and which went to the priest as income. In many places, the priest could claim specific portions, then choose whether to provide feasts or sell the meat onward. That helps explain why renewed participation in cult could revive the market in sacrificial meat. Regulations often spell out the division with hard clarity, listing which parts must be sold, which must remain on the premises, and which worshippers may consume. Some sanctuaries even forbade taking any portion away because symbolically it had all been consecrated. When you look at the system coldly, it can seem as if sacrifice offered a sacred excuse for a communal meat meal. Even so, local practice did not always look the same across the empire. In the western provinces, archaeology speaks where inscriptions fall silent. Heaps of bones, skulls, broken cups, and feast debris. In some Celtic regions, horses appear as sacrificial victims, a pattern that stands out sharply without always being explained. In parts of North Africa shaped by older Punic custom, Worship could focus on open-air precincts, with altars and minimal buildings, where a family or group offered an animal, ate what they could, and buried the remains under memorial stones. Excavations in such sites reveal layers of charred wood mixed with half-burned bones, lamps, and small vessels built up over generations. These differences warn against assuming one uniform template for every province. Yet alongside local variation, there were also widely shared habits. The offering of an animal, the communal meal that followed, and the social gravity that made the sanctuary a centre of gathering. At major healing centres, sacrifice also became a way to support long-term visitors. In one famous sanctuary, a patient might dream that the god instructed him not only to sacrifice but to share the sacred portions with other pilgrims. Those other pilgrims could include people staying for weeks or months while seeking cures. Healing sanctuaries often combined multiple roles: treatment, ritual instruction, and sometimes initiation into deeper rites. Many deities, not just healing gods, drew mixed crowds with mixed motives. Around such shrines there were always dependents, permanent residents, and people living off the flow of visitors. Some were poor, some were fugitives using sacred protection, and many were simply part of the ecosystem that grew wherever crowds gathered. Artisans, vendors, and merchants producing standardized offerings. A silversmith making miniature shrines, a wholesaler selling statuettes, workshops turning out the same token objects again and again. These figures belong naturally to the landscape of popular worship. You would expect their stalls and labour to cluster near sanctuary gates. To understand how all this functioned day to day, you have to remember that religious and civic were often tangled together. Local elites might serve their city one year in a civic role and the next year as priests or festival sponsors. Even within a single office, duties could slide between honouring gods and receiving officials. In some places, statues were crowned with wreaths. Visiting governor, images were oiled and decorated, processions were organised, speeches were delivered, and workers were assigned to escort divine images as if the gods themselves were part of public protocol. Officials paid courtesy visits to temples. Temples hosted civic business under their porticos, and sacred space could function as the city's most convenient stage for public life. Yet the most dramatic images of pagan religion in later imagination are not the polite ceremonies of civic elites. They are the wild devotees, the frenzied dancers, the self-wounding, the ecstatic rites of certain Eastern cults that shocked outside observers. Some traditions featured eunuch priests, loud instruments, and displays meant to look like possession. Others marked grief and joy through extreme gestures, shaved heads, rolling dances, and public performance. But when you step back, the evidence for this kind of ecstatic fanaticism is actually narrow compared with the number of gods worshipped across the empire. It was striking, memorable, and frequently retold, yet it belonged to a limited set of cults and regions. In most sanctuaries, the central figure was far more ordinary: the priest, caretaker, or temple attendant. Travellers mentioned them as helpful and unremarkable, people who kept order, answered questions, and performed routine tasks. A satirical moralist could mock the scene in a great temple by describing attendants who announced worshippers, gestured as if bathing or anointing a god, pretended to dress divine hair from a distance, or offered legal documents to the deity as if the shrine were a courthouse. The details may be exaggerated for effect, but the underlying picture is important. A temple precinct could feel like a small, organised world with assigned roles, repeated routines, and constant human activity around an image that was treated as present and powerful. When you finally focus on the idol itself, the reality can seem oddly anticlimactic. In many places, the statue remained behind screens or barriers, sometimes rarely visible. Some shrines opened doors at set times, perhaps at dawn for hymns, then again for sacrifices later, and closed at night. Other temples were never opened, or never closed, or followed no stable timetable at all. The sources talk far more about what happened in the precinct than about what was seen deep inside the sanctuary. The statue functioned less like an actor in daily life and more like a fixed point of memory and meaning, an image that anchored the community's idea of the god, while the living religion unfolded around it through processions, meals, music, and public display. Night transformed these spaces. Lamps offered as gifts, torch-bearing statues, and carefully arranged lighting could make a precinct feel charged, almost enchanted. Certain priestly groups deliberately heightened the effect by opening doors after rituals, anointing statues with perfumed oil so they gleamed, and filling the area with candlelight. Dressing and adorning the images was a form of literal devotion, clothing, jewelry, special servants assigned to carry robes or decorate the god, and processions where the idol was displayed like a royal presence. The sensory world of worship, light, scent, music, movement, was crafted to produce emotion. Because written evidence survives unevenly, we risk imagining that Eastern cults were elaborate, while Western ones were bare. In reality, many Eastern cults spread widely across the empire, bringing their rituals with them, even where the public record did not preserve detailed descriptions. Greek cities tended to carve expansive, discursive texts into stone. Latin regions did so less, and the conquered often adopted Roman habits of brevity. So the silence of inscriptions in some provinces does not necessarily mean the silence of worship. It may simply mean the silence of the record. One place, however, shows what a fully documented religious world looked like when inscriptions happened to survive in huge quantity. Near Stratonicea in Caria, two major sanctuaries stood within walking distance. One tied to Hecate at Lagina, and another to a local hilltop god identified by outsiders as Zeus. The hilltop sanctuary sat within a large walled enclosure, and its surfaces were crowded with texts. Hundreds of inscriptions on walls and buildings, turning stone into a public archive of belief. The site included not only temples, but dining areas, tables supplied from sacrificial portions, additional structures with special names, and large porticos coated in stucco. Precious offerings were displayed, including costly objects dedicated to commemorate divine appearances. Outside the enclosure were pens for sacrificial animals and inns for those who planned to eat and stay. Inside were formal seating arrangements substantial enough to resemble a small theatre, and space for crowds to dine under temporary shelters. Wherever a visitor looked, there would have been painted lettering advertising honours, telling miracle stories or setting out rules. What music to use, which victims to offer, which procedures to follow for a request or thanksgiving. The festivals tied to this sanctuary were not minor. Invitations were sent to neighbouring communities and even to distant cities, while local heralds and posted notices urged everyone to participate. There were multiple celebrations across the cycle of years. An annual multi-day festival, a shorter festival for the goddess, and a larger event held at longer intervals. At the start of the main festival, the god's image was brought down the paved road into the city for a ceremonial stay. During that visit, the priest used public spaces to stage performances by hired professionals, distributed oil for bathing, handed out money to the needy, provided wine and meals, and turned the city into a living extension of the sanctuary. When the god was escorted back up to his hill, those who accompanied the procession received gifts along the way. Other celebrations were even more lavish, emphasizing equality at banquets, and encouraging an atmosphere of warmth, affection, and communal joy. Over time, the circle of participants widened. Men and women gained access to rights previously reserved. Outsiders were welcomed, and people of different statuses, including rural visitors and slaves, were invited to join the feasts. Competitive generosity among elite citizens steadily expanded the scale and frequency of distributions. Days of public provision multiplied across the calendar, especially as the same priestly leadership held responsibilities for both nearby sanctuaries and their processions. At Lagina, the priest also invested in buildings and furnishings, new porticos, monumental gateways, colonnades, decorated furniture for sacred dining, and other improvements that shaped what visitors saw and felt. A permanent community lived and worked around the sanctuary, joined by hired performers who stayed year-round. From these families, a choir of children was selected and trained to sing an inherited hymn each day in the civic council building, crowned with flowers, carrying flowers, accompanied by a musician. It was a striking image, ritual song woven into the morning rhythm of government. Nearby, under the portico, stood statues of several gods believed to work miracles, and performances were staged in their honor. If you wanted a single scene that captures how deeply public worship could saturate daily life, music in civic space, miracle-working images in a colonnade, festivals feeding the city, processions moving gods between sanctuary and streets, you could picture that portico on an ordinary morning around the year 200, when religion was not a private corner of life, but its most visible, organized, and unavoidable center. Were all those countless gods nothing more than human fabrication, and the entire religious world we have been looking at built on illusion? It is a question worth treating with respect, because versions of the same impulse still live on. People still look for signs, still consult fate, still shape their day around unseen forces. Yet anyone trying to describe the ancient world with a historian's discipline is pushed into an uncomfortable posture. You cannot write as if the gods truly ruled from the sky, but you also cannot pretend they were irrelevant. Whether or not they were real, they worked. They answered something in the human mind and in human fear, and that is where the investigation really begins. If you strip away everything that could have happened just as easily somewhere else, the trading, the performances, the social bustle, what remains that feels uniquely religious? A strong place to start is the great healing sanctuaries, because they were everywhere and because they drew an ocean of suffering people. If you count every shrine where the sick sought help, no other kind of worship attracted more desperate visitors. When you look at what those places promised, two elements stand out again and again: dreams and health. In that light, the most basic task of the divine seems almost practical. Religion, at its core, was expected to make the unwell well again. You can see the expectation in the way people address their gods. Sometimes it appears as a title that needs no explanation. A god hailed as healer, saviour, rescuer, with no further detail because everyone already understands what is meant. Sometimes it appears in plain gratitude for a cure. Asclepius dominates this territory, but he is not alone. Isis and Serapis are praised as powerful healers too, credited with endless medical wonders. And the boundary is not strict. In practice, many gods could be asked to mend a body, because pain does not care which name is spoken over it. From the body, it is a short step to the mind, because ancient people often explained mental collapse in the most concrete supernatural terms they had. What we call illness could be described as invasion, a hostile spirit inside a person, a force that had to be driven out. Stories survive of holy men confronting such afflictions, calling on divine power and forcing the intruder to depart. This kind of scene reads dramatically, and it certainly fed popular imagination. But it does not look like it had the same public, respectable place as healing for the body. For the possessed, pagans do not seem to have had famous sanctuaries that functioned like hospitals of the spirit, with a clear, recognised system of help. Instead, there were scattered specialists, private tricks, whispered services offered in markets and back streets, remedies purchased in the shadows, not in the open courtyards of major temples. Christians, however, made exorcism a signature. From the mid-2nd century onward, Christian writers repeatedly claim that their communities cast out demons in full public view, that the afflicted were freed, that the spirits confessed under command, and that this visible power brought observers to belief. The claims are astonishingly direct, repeated across regions and generations, and later echoed in the stories of saints. Whatever we think of the explanations behind the events, the testimony points to a widespread feeling of helplessness in the face of mental disturbance. People wanted a force greater than themselves to step in, just as they did when the body failed. In that need, Christianity offered something organised and confident, while pagan practice in this area appears fragmented and uncertain. That contrast opens a broader split in the ancient religious landscape. A split that people at the time recognised, even if they did not define it in modern terms. There were things sought openly in temples and sanctuaries, framed as legitimate requests. And there were other desires that drifted into a different realm, the realm of private manipulation and morally uneasy techniques. Winning at the racetrack, bending someone's love, harming an enemy, gaining secret knowledge to use against a rival, forcing luck to obey, these belong to a shadowy category. The dividing line was not drawn by logic alone, but by moral feeling and social acceptance. Even then, it was flexible. A prayer for victory in a brutal arena might not feel immoral to most pagans, even if an outsider condemned it. The point is that the ancient world carried two overlapping systems: public religion that could be displayed with pride, and a darker toolkit used for personal advantage. When you look at what people openly asked for, the pattern is clear, at least at the centre. Health comes first. After that, the requests fan outward into the full range of daily anxiety. People prayed for beauty closely tied to well-being, for hair restored, for strength returned. They prayed for children, for a household to continue. They asked for money and security, for release from bondage, for relief from crushing obligations, for help against storms and disasters, for rescue at sea, for safe travel through bandit country, for protection from enemies, for the return of soldiers from patrol, for safety and profit. The ancient prayer is not a rare philosophical exercise. It is a practical language shaped by danger. The record we have is frustratingly thin in places because inscriptions rarely tell the whole story of why a dedication was made. Often a formula is used instead, a brief phrase that means everything without explaining anything. A man gives thanks for himself and his people, a compressed line that says, in 4 words, that the household is the centre of fear and hope. Alongside family stand animals that keep a family alive, especially the ox that pulls the plough, The evidence for such concerns survives unevenly and often in certain regions more than others, not because other people did not worry about their livestock, but because writing and stone records are selective. And when it comes to crops, the silence is even stranger. Agriculture ruled real life, yet prayers about harvest do not survive in proportion to that importance. It may be that rural faith, closest to soil and weather, left little trace because the people who lived it were far from writing, and their ways were not recorded on durable materials. There are, of course, conventional pairings that match what you would expect. Travellers and merchants turn to Mercury or Hermes. Herdsmen and hunters turn to Silvanus. Earthquakes and storms are laid at the feet of the great sky god. Yet even here the neat map breaks down. A god known mainly for one sphere could still be asked for anything. A city goddess who reigned alone in her territory could be expected to hear every kind of prayer, not just the requests that literary tradition assigned her. Zeus and Jupiter, with their endless titles, swallow every function. The system was not a tidy machine. It was a living network of habit, local custom, and personal experience. Modern observers often criticize the ancient relationship with the gods as transactional, a bargain, an exchange of gifts for help. But that judgment usually imports an outside standard of what worship should be. Many pagans were comfortable with the idea that the point of piety was benefit. A god's power mattered more than emotional intimacy, and some philosophers even argued that a perfect divine being would not respond to human love as if it were a personal romance. Ancient religion, in practice, could look like negotiation because it grew out of need. If there is one need a modern person expects to find everywhere, it is the hunger for everlasting life. And yet, when you search the evidence, that longing is oddly faint. Clear promises of personal immortality appear less often than you would expect. There were cults that offered deeper instruction through rites designed to overwhelm the senses, producing awe through ritual drama and secrecy. But secrecy hides what was taught, and the historical trail goes cold. A few groups seem to have offered hopes beyond death, yet the proof is usually indirect, fragmentary, and easy to overinterpret. You can catch hints in scattered places. In some circles devoted to Dionysus, there were ceremonies of instruction that may have carried promises, but we cannot recover the content with confidence. In the cult of Isis, we have a vivid narrative of a devotee who undergoes expensive training under priestly guidance and receives assurance of blessedness. Yet even there, the promise is framed more as a favoured life under divine protection than as an explicit guarantee of endless existence. It is rebirth in a practical sense, a new standing in the world, not a clearly defined eternal transformation. Mithraism offers another set of clues. Underground meeting rooms, shared meals, hymns, and a ladder of ranks. There are half-legible phrases that sound like salvation language, and there are later claims that try to press the cult into a clear doctrine of eternal rebirth. But some of those neat statements are unreliable, and the surviving ancient critics do not give a simple answer. One speaks of the soul moving through planetary spheres, another of the soul entering a new form of life. That is not the same thing as a comforting heaven promised to everyone who joins. At times, you see a painted scene of the dead feasting among the blessed, or an epitaph that speaks lightly of a small soul paid over to death. The mixture is telling. If a sweeping faith in guaranteed eternal joy had been central to everyday pagan worship, it should appear more clearly and more consistently. Instead, we find fragments that could belong to philosophy, borrowed poetry, local custom, or the growing influence of new religious ideas. Even when writers speak of joining a pure company after death, they often leave it unclear which rites they mean, what exactly is gained, and whether the language is literal or symbolic. One important caution follows from this. The fact that a god is said to die and return does not automatically mean worshippers believed the same would happen to them. Modern scholarship has sometimes treated that link as obvious, but the ancient evidence does not firmly support it. Even the famous ritual of cleansing in a bull's blood, often presented as proof of a hunger for life beyond death, seems to have promised something more limited. Extended life in ritual purity for a set span of years, not an open-ended eternity. When ancient writers do make broad claims about pagan views of the afterlife, the results are revealing. One Christian argues that pagans must believe in survival after death, because they practice rites at tombs and speak of spirits and possession. Yet he struggles to prove the point directly and leans on vague references to oracles. Another writer cites a specific oracle that answers, yes, the soul continues, existing in the upper air. That is significant, but it is also significant that no single universally familiar saviour god is named as the guarantor of personal immortality for the masses. Nothing like that dominates the landscape. Even among cultivated, devout pagans, the way they speak about initiation is often surprisingly casual. A lover of old religion can list the pleasures of piety and mention secret rites, festivals, dances, sacrifices, and initiations in the same breath, as if describing a calendar of rich experiences rather than a desperate search for eternal rescue. That tone does not prove that no one hoped for more, but it suggests that for many, the emotional centre of worship was here and now, health restored, danger averted, community strengthened, joy experienced in the presence of the divine. The gods may have been debated, doubted, mocked, or defended, but the system endured because it answered immediate human needs, with stories, rituals, and places where fear could be managed and hope could be made visible. Writers on the pagan side often treated the Christian claim of bodily resurrection as either a confusion of ideas or a joke in bad taste. Celsus scoffed at it as a clumsy misunderstanding of the soul's migration from one life to another, and Caecilius, in a Latin dialogue, takes much the same line. Seneca goes further in another direction. He dismisses the underworld of old Greek stories, with its tortures and monsters, and replaces it with a cooler vision of existence. A spirit released from flesh and absorbed into a brighter, more rarefied life of light. That approach became typical among educated people who liked abstract answers. It shows both the power and the weakness of that way of thinking. For most belief systems in the empire, whenever people pictured survival after death at all, they usually imagined it as a soul leaving the body, a spark returning to something vast and divine. Yet there was a problem hidden inside that idea. A person does not long merely for a surviving fragment. What people feel as their real self is a personality, a face, a voice, a story. If the only thing that continues is a thin, impersonal particle, then the promise of immortality loses much of its emotional force. It becomes something you can accept as a concept without feeling it as a hope. The everyday record reinforces that distance. When inscriptions use words like saviour or salvation, they usually mean rescue in this life. Healing, safety, protection, success, not an eternal future for the soul. Even on tombs, people often joke about extinction so repeatedly that the jokes harden into standard phrases and short formulas. And when you look at rules for dining groups that met in sacred settings, the tone is strikingly practical, even earthy. the warnings that matter are about behaviour at the table, not about eternity. If modern readers have sometimes imagined that sacred meals offered a path to immortality, the surviving voices do not confirm it. The quiet absence of such claims is, by itself, revealing. Festivals, initiations, music, and wine satisfied desires that were immediate and human. Even when crowds gathered at solemn meals officially labelled mysteries, what they seemed to have gained was closeness, a sense of fellowship with the divine present among them, not a guarantee of endless life. The larger purpose here is simple: to measure how well common emotional needs matched what religion actually provided. We can begin with the individual, because individuals multiplied into millions are what give a religion its strength. But before returning to private feelings, it helps to widen the lens. Ancient observers who could step back from their own society often noticed that religion also reinforced the social order. They say so openly, sometimes with a frankness that makes their motives easy to watch. Plutarch, for example, advises that public generosity should be tied to sacred occasions, because honouring a god gives a noble reason for lavish gifts and at the same time shapes the crowd's imagination. When ordinary people see their leading citizens competing in devotion and spending freely for the gods, they absorb a stronger sense of the god's greatness, and they also learn to connect that greatness with the local elite. That does not mean Plutarch is cynically faking belief. He can sincerely accept two truths at once. Faith is real for him, and it is useful for holding a community together. Belief in divine punishment fits this same public logic, but it appears unevenly across the empire. In some regions, especially parts of Phrygia, people expected local gods to punish wrongdoing, and the most feared act was often false swearing. Across many places, sacred water is imagined as the instrument of vengeance, burning or destroying the perjurer's body. Tomb desecration is threatened too, sometimes with the wrath of powerful collective gods. Yet most of this punishment is not framed as a universal moral system that hunts criminals wherever they hide. More often it is tied to sacred boundaries, taboo violations, offences committed in the very presence of the divine, or breaking ritual rules linked to purity. The grand idea that the gods enforce the same moral code everywhere as a constant invisible police appears only in scattered hints, and mostly in traditions influenced by stricter moral thinking. What emerges is not a single empire-wide doctrine of guilt and judgment, but a patchwork of expectations. People feared divine anger most reliably in connection with the deepest taboos, things like incest or killing one's own kin, and even then the belief is more sensed than formally argued. Plutarch's position belongs to a long tradition that recognized the civic value of religion, but his emphasis is slightly different from older blunt claims about controlling the masses. He wants popular faith encouraged so that it lifts the crowd's gaze upward toward reverence, and that reverence naturally reflects back onto the respected families who lead the city. The gods and the city's great men appear in harmony. That harmony was not only propaganda. Private prayers made on behalf of towns and neighbourhoods suggest genuine confidence that the gods cared for whole communities, not only for isolated individuals. When disaster struck, city leaders sometimes sought divine help or guidance, and afterwards some inscriptions declare that prayers truly brought deliverance, that plagues ended, earthquakes ceased, invaders were scattered. Even if we remain skeptical, the people who wrote those lines believed the partnership worked. So how was contact with the divine imagined to happen? For most people, it began with images. Statues were not just reminders, they were treated as dwellings, places where the god could listen and act. Even outside observers report this as the prevailing assumption. The readiness to assign power to images went so far that statues of famous humans could be credited with cures, with warnings, with signs. Stories circulate of a statue that kills by falling, then is punished and somehow retrieved. Of another that heals. Of images that provide answers or wonders. The line between human and divine could blur easily when the world was already filled with signs. A second pathway ran through sleep. Dreams were not a side topic. They were a common language of religion. People did not only interpret dreams after the fact, they went looking for them. Inscriptions and stories repeat the same pattern. Someone was advised, commanded, instructed in a dream. The formula is so frequent it becomes a badge of legitimacy. Sometimes heroes, not gods, appear in sleep, including newly elevated figures whose cults were barely established, or even the protective spirit of a military unit. Whole communities could act on a dream as well, probably through the experience of a priest or a leading figure who interpreted it for others. Sailors expected dream guidance from local heroes about safe anchorages, and travellers could meet a wide range of supernatural visitors in the night. The practice was so widespread that critics could speak of tens of thousands having such experiences. In many places, a person could enter a shrine with the explicit intention of receiving a dream sign about a problem. Most of the time, the dreamer did not need a specialist. People interpreted for themselves. The language of being commanded becomes a standard claim, carved in stone, as if to say, "This is not my idea, it is the god's order." Alongside images and dreams stood a third channel, the oracle. Here the divine message usually passed through a human voice, a priest, a priestess, a seer. Some writers talk about decline in the old central shrines, but others insist prophecy still held honour broadly, and there are signs that Eastern oracles retained strong reputations well into later centuries. The reliability of oracles remained a live issue not only between pagans and Christians, but even within pagan culture itself, because some philosophical schools distrusted them sharply. That debate matters because it shows two things at once. The institution was still important enough to argue about, and polytheism was never a single unified mind. When we ask how lively pagan religion truly was, the evidence instantly becomes messy. Open atheism was socially dangerous, and public denial of the gods could provoke outrage. Mobs shouted that Christians were godless, and even pagan writers described disbelief as unacceptable. Yet at the same time, the world was full of mockery. Graffiti insulted major gods, taverns displayed crude jokes at sacred expense, and wealthy patrons could even commission artworks that teased the divine banquet itself. The empire held both fear and laughter, reverence and irreverence, sometimes in the same town. This is why sweeping claims about waves of religiosity are so fragile. To describe the feelings of tens of millions from a handful of texts is like measuring an entire age from a single provincial headline. Religious emotion is also partly private, and often not the sort of thing people announce plainly. When someone like Lactantius attacks pagan practice as shallow, fingertip worship, he is speaking polemically, but still in a way meant to land on recognizable habits. When Porphyry argues that true devotion requires turning away from pleasure and greed, he is defining a different standard of piety, one closer to moral seriousness. Meanwhile, poets and rhetors can describe intense moments of awe and longing, a sense of reaching toward the divine the way children reach for absent parents. And Seneca can mock public devotion as madness, while still admitting that custom keeps the rituals alive. These are not stages in a neat story of rise and fall. They are overlapping human types. It is tempting to solve the contradictions by dividing history into eras of crisis, revival, anxiety, and decline. But those labels often rest on thin foundations. Later silence in inscriptions is real. Yet silence can mean many things beyond fading faith. For earlier periods, historians lean heavily on literature, and literature mostly reflects a narrow, educated class. Worse, even that class is not captured cleanly, because it contains every shade of feeling, from ecstatic devotion to dry skepticism. There are fashions in religion, just as in clothing or speech. But fashions do not tell you how deep the underlying needs run. Even the most famous spiritual voice of the age, the emperor who wrote private reflections to himself, cannot be used as a measuring rod. His inward discipline may be intensely personal, rather than representative. If his writings had vanished, or if a similar diary from another decade suddenly appeared, it would be easy to fit it into the gaps simply because the evidence is too thin to resist new pieces. His devotion is compelling as a human document, but it cannot tell us with confidence how typical he was, even among the elite. The same caution applies to other circles of educated piety. We can listen to them closely, but we cannot safely treat them as the empire speaking with one voice. Figures like Marcus Aurelius tend to dominate any discussion of religion in the Roman Empire. But this is partly because such people were already inclined to reflect on their inner lives. They wrote about belief because belief mattered deeply to them. Most people did not leave such reflections behind. Religious experience was unevenly distributed, shaped as much by personality as by education. Some individuals were especially receptive to signs and visions. One man from Cyzicus travelled to Pergamon seeking relief from epilepsy and later reported that the god appeared to him, spoke with him, and cured him through an unexpected illness. The detail that they conversed stands out. It shows how real such encounters felt to those who experienced them. Similar claims appear even in modern political movements, where leaders long dead are said to give advice in visions. The human tendency itself is constant. Inscriptions confirm this unevenness. When dedications go beyond simple formulas, they are disproportionately made by people closely tied to cult life, such as priests and temple servants. This is especially clear in sanctuaries devoted to healing gods, where priests themselves erected many of the altars. The same pattern appears in Eastern cults, whose clergy placed themselves prominently before the public. Their livelihood depended on the god, but that does not make their devotion false. In fact, their sincerity is underlined by cases where priests of one god honoured another. As a group, they represent the most intensely devout segment of society. It would be wrong to imagine that professional servants of the gods secretly doubted the divine. They lived in a world where belief was widely shared, even among the educated elite. Marcus Aurelius himself trusted healing dreams while doubting travelling miracle workers. His teacher shared those views. Across the 2nd and 3rd centuries, belief in divine powers was normal, though belief did not mean agreement on every detail. Religious ideas varied as much as emotional responses to the sacred. Those emotions, however, cannot be measured with any precision. The beliefs of the educated appear less unusual when we move beyond surviving books. Stone inscriptions echo the same assumptions found in literature. Acceptance of the gods is widespread and unself-conscious. Skeptical voices like Seneca or Lucian can mislead us if read in isolation. They are exceptions, not the rule. Inscriptions describe gods with simple titles and brief praises, often without stories or explanation. The divine appears as a collection of attributes, rather than as characters in myths. Gods are powerful, swift, exalted, saving. They are rarely portrayed acting in narrative scenes. Literature mirrors this pattern. After the early imperial period, writers show little interest in retelling myths as stories. Religion becomes descriptive rather than narrative. Documents preserved on papyrus tell the same story. Despite the enormous number of texts from Egypt, only a small fraction deals directly with theology. Philosophy appears rarely, and when it does, it focuses on ethics or logic rather than the gods. What dominates instead are hymns, songs of praise, ritual texts, and fictional scenes of worship. These materials feel local, rooted in particular regions and traditions. When more elaborate theological works were wanted, temples themselves supplied them through internal libraries. And beyond all else stood Homer, whose epics functioned as the shared sacred literature of Greek culture. Modern accounts often rely heavily on mystical or philosophical writings to describe ancient religious experience. These texts capture intense inner states, but they exaggerate their importance. They represent a small circle of readers and thinkers. Calling this deepest layers religion without qualification distorts the picture. Religion as lived by most people was simpler, more practical, and less inwardly dramatic. Any account that focuses only on elite writers misses much of reality. Religious life included mild interest, habitual participation, indifference, mockery, and rejection alongside deep devotion. This diversity does not weaken the picture. It strengthens it. Religion belonged to everyone, not just to mystics or philosophers. The gap between elite and popular belief is clearest in attitudes toward supernatural intervention. Educated observers often criticized what they called superstition, meaning the belief that gods interfered directly in everyday events. A story from the provinces describes two men witnessing an eagle entangled by snakes. They freed the bird and believed they had acted under divine guidance. They set up a dedication in response. To them, the divine had entered their lives at a roadside. To someone like Plutarch, this would be superstition, an ordinary event misread as a sign. Superstition in this sense grew more common over time. The increasing visibility of magic shows this clearly. Manuals, spells, curses, and charms multiply across the empire. People of status come to credit supernatural explanations that earlier generations might have rejected. Even emperors turn to magical assistance. Old ideas spread into new social circles. At the same time, traditional philosophy lost its hold. This did not happen because schools collapsed or libraries vanished. The decline begins earlier, during periods of peace. Contemporaries blamed philosophy itself. Philosophers argued endlessly, contradicted one another, and overturned every claim. To the outsider, their debates seemed pointless noise. Practical people turned away. By the 3rd century, abstract reasoning no longer commanded respect. Wonder-working, visions and enchantments inspired fear rather than laughter. Rationalism now had to defend itself. When Constantine dismissed philosophy publicly, few laughed. Many agreed. As elite and popular views converged, the old contrast between religion and superstition softened. Differences remained, but they were differences of complexity, not of belief. Both sides accepted that divine favor could bring tangible benefits to entire communities. Inscriptions describe priestesses whose devotion caused gods to become visibly active, sending signs through men, women, and children. Shepherds and farmers relied on local prophets for the fertility of their flocks. Holy figures were believed to intercede for entire regions. By the 3rd century, emperors themselves were praised for securing good harvests and calm seas through piety. Alongside belief in divine action grew anxiety about divine nature. Superstition also meant fearing the gods as malicious and unpredictable. Educated critics rejected this. They insisted the gods were good, incapable of harm, and far removed from human weakness. Myths portraying divine violence or suffering were dismissed as childish or barbaric. The gods could not be wounded, chained, seduced, or deceived. Such stories dishonored them. This view appears repeatedly among educated pagans. The divine was perfect goodness, beyond need or desire, untouched by the material world. Gods did not eat, lust, suffer, or change. They could not be bribed by offerings or manipulated by ritual. Worship might honor tradition, but it could not compel the divine. This higher view stripped traditional religion of its stories and rituals. Yet it did not stop anyone from worshipping as they always had. Allegorical interpretation provided a way out. Old myths were reinterpreted as symbols. Shocking stories were said to conceal hidden truths. Intellectuals claimed ancient poets had encoded wisdom beneath absurd images. This method allowed people to keep their heritage while accommodating new ideas. Another solution placed intermediary beings between humans and the highest divine power. These beings handled everything crude or material. They delivered messages, caused signs, punished wrongdoing, and managed the physical world. This structure allowed gods to remain perfect and distant, while still explaining everyday religious experience. Both pagans and Christians accepted such hierarchies, even if they used different names. At the lowest level of this unseen world lay countless spirits, tied to specific places, people, and concerns. They governed homes, fields, animals, races, rivalries, and fortunes. This realm was chaotic, inventive, uncontrolled. No priests ruled it, no doctrine organized it. Everyone believed in it, because it explained the events that touched daily life most closely. Above these spirits stood local gods, then greater gods, and finally, for some thinkers, a supreme power. But for most people, the question of how gods ranked among themselves was unimportant. Worship focused on relationships, not theology. Where hierarchy was imagined, it often mirrored earthly rule. Gods were kings, queens, commanders. In troubled times they appeared armed, dressed like soldiers or emperors. The sun emerged as the most powerful figure of all, visible, ruling, invincible. Coins, mosaics, and statues present him with the symbols of sovereignty. The image closely resembles later portrayals of Christ as cosmic ruler. Political power and religious imagery merged. Some emperors promoted the sun as supreme patron. Temples were built, festivals declared, coins struck. Yet these efforts rose and vanished with their sponsors. They did not replace traditional worship. Claims that solar worship nearly became a universal religion exaggerate the evidence. Imperial favor alone could not reshape belief. What did spread was the idea of a highest power above others, whether called the sun or named differently in different regions. This was not strict monotheism. It was a merging of gods into a chief figure without denying the rest. People resisted any claim that erased ancestral deities. At the beginning of this period, one of Plutarch's close companions, speaks of Apollo almost casually, wondering aloud whether he is the sun itself, or the master of the sun, or even the father of everything that lies beyond human sight. At the far end of the same era, Firmicus Maternus praises the sun with titles once reserved for Jupiter, calling him the greatest and best, the ruler of the heavens, the mind that governs the universe, and the supreme authority over all. Between these two voices stands Porphyry, whose philosophical writings shaped later thinkers, and were known to Firmicus as well. All three drew from older Platonic and Stoic traditions, though none of them applied those ideas with precision or strict consistency. Public speakers of the age openly acknowledged that many people believed Apollo, the sun, and Dionysus were ultimately the same divine force. Citizens of entire cities accepted this without difficulty. Others went further, seeing all gods as expressions of a single power, making no meaningful distinction between one divine name and another. This way of thinking appears repeatedly across generations, earlier in Seneca and later in Porphyry. The god was one, but his energy appeared in many forms, working through familiar divine figures. As one Roman put it, it mattered little whether help came from one name or another. Plutarch himself, when reflecting on Egyptian myths, paused to note how closely such stories matched Stoic ideas, where Dionysus symbolized the life-giving force of nature. By this time, it had become part of the intellectual inheritance of the age to imagine one god acting through many manifestations, whether called Zeus, the sun, or something else entirely. Yet this remained abstract teaching, largely confined to educated circles. Outside lecture halls and philosophical discussions, it left very few traces. One rare example appears in a fragment by a writer of the 3rd century who attempted to explain an ancient verse claiming that Zeus, Hades, the sun, and Dionysus were all one. To support this idea, he turned to an oracle that described a single divine power, taking different names with the changing seasons. Winter belonged to Hades, spring to Zeus, summer to the sun, and autumn to another sacred name. The message was mysterious rather than clear, but it agreed with what philosophers had already taught. Many gods were aspects of a single divine reality. In this case, the idea had escaped the schools and reached a broader audience. Public speakers sometimes assumed such ideas among their listeners. A guide for rhetoricians from the 2nd century explains that educated audiences accepted the notion that all gods came from a first divine source. Some believed that one god gathered within himself the power of many others, so that the sun and Apollo were one, as were Artemis, the moon, and other goddesses. Different peoples honoured different divine names, but universal recognition marked the highest praise. A later philosopher echoed this sentiment even more boldly, claiming that across the entire world there was agreement that one god ruled as father and king, while many others served as his children and assistants. These statements come from writers who travelled widely and addressed large audiences. Their observations fit well with the broader evidence. To understand them properly, however, the very word monotheism must be questioned. Like many abstract labels, it creates confusion. It suggests belief in a single god, but it says nothing about what that god is or how other powers are understood. Jews and Christians saw the highest divine power as morally opposed to all others. Most people in the Roman world did not. They accepted a hierarchy of powers without conflict. A supreme god could exist without denying the reality or legitimacy of lesser ones. To remove all divine power except one would have meant destroying ancestral traditions, local identities, and cultural memory. Such a step was unthinkable. As a result, true monotheism barely existed in pagan life. Philosophical schools taught unity in theory, but everyday worship remained unchanged. Outside elite circles, the question was not whether there was one god, but which god stood highest. That idea was ancient and universal, going back to the earliest traditions of Greece, Italy, and the Near East. Devotion to a particular supreme god did not deny the existence of others. It simply elevated one above the rest. Titles like highest or unconquered were shared freely, without logical exclusivity. Gods coexisted peacefully, much as rival emperors acknowledged each other's divine patrons without conflict. In later centuries, exaggerated praise became routine. The empire delighted in grand titles and shouted superlatives. These were applied to officials and deities alike. Calling a god the greatest no longer implied real supremacy. Worshippers moved easily between singular and plural language without sensing any contradiction. Modern readers struggle with this fluidity, but it was normal at the time. At the level of ordinary worship, divine order was understood even more loosely. One striking practice was the use of multiple names for a single deity. A local goddess might be addressed as Artemis, Demeter, Aphrodite, or Hecate, all at once. The intention was not confusion but praise. The mother of the gods borrowed symbols from other goddesses, blending identities freely. Isis was the most extreme example. She absorbed names and roles from across the empire, praised in long hymns as ruler of sea and land, creator of all things, known under countless local titles. Such hymns were likely delivered by priests to broad audiences, many of whom had little interest in philosophy, but plenty of patience for devotion. These priests spoke differently from professional orators. They did not analyze theology. They proclaimed greatness. Their message was simple. This God is mighty because everywhere people say so. Travel and movement across the empire made such comparisons unavoidable. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and officials encountered new cults and recognized familiar powers beneath foreign names. Oracles and hymns confirm this sense of shared divinity. Art reflects the same tendency, though it must be used carefully. Coins, reliefs, and mosaics often combine symbols of many gods, especially in the eastern provinces. Over time, these combinations grew more elaborate. Yet artistic style and space filling often explain the mixtures better than belief. Sacred art followed trends also seen in secular decoration. Overcrowding and complexity were fashionable. This makes art unreliable as direct evidence for theology. What matters more is practice. Temples regularly housed images of multiple gods. Shrines welcomed dedications to foreign deities. Mithraic sanctuaries included figures from other cults. Priests permitted and supervised these additions. Initiates of one god often served another. Far from betrayal, this was accepted behavior. The gods were understood to be friendly to one another. Harmony below reflected harmony above. Even emperors who emphasized a special bond with the sun or Jupiter did not deny other gods. Their claims were relative, not absolute. Had history continued along the same path, another divine patron might have risen to prominence in time. Change itself was a sign of vitality. Yet something did change. By the end of this period, vast numbers had joined the Christian Church. Why? The answer lies in what people sought when they changed belief. Converts wanted reality and proof. Accounts of conversion consistently focus on visible power. Water turned into wine, rain brought to dry land, blindness cured, spirits driven out. These acts persuaded witnesses that a new divine force was present. both pagan and Christian sources tell the same kind of stories. Belief followed demonstration. Ancient thinkers agreed on this logic. True divinity proved itself through lasting impact and beneficial power. Fraud faded quickly. The divine brought good, not harm. Its messengers lived simply and sought no payment. Once these qualities were established, devotion followed naturally. Awe, gratitude, and love came afterward. Evangelists existed outside Christianity as well. Pagan teachers travelled widely, preaching moral or spiritual reform. Some were respected, others despised. One such figure from Syria travelled west, speaking persuasively to many peoples, carrying teachings he believed were gifts from the gods to humanity. He was not Christian, yet his description resembles that of early missionaries. A similar pattern appears at the opening of a Gnostic text from the early 3rd century. In it, a disciple describes how the Spirit sent him out to speak about the beauty he had discovered in the divine. As he spoke, people gathered. Some mocked him openly. Others listened but hesitated. A few, however, were moved and asked to learn more. With Gnosticism, we come close to the Judeo-Christian world, where organized missions, appointed messengers, and deliberate teaching were already familiar ideas. This was not the case for most pagan figures who travelled and spoke. Men like Eutychnius could never have reached large audiences. More importantly, they lacked the one element that consistently produced real conversion: the public display of divine power. That element, however, appeared clearly in a very different kind of activity, centered on the oracle at Abunutaichus. The man behind it, Alexander, sent agents across the provinces to spread reports of prophetic answers. It was a planned effort, not an accident. Later, Christian writers describe pagan religion accurately when they note how stories of prophecies, healings, punishments, and divine signs were constantly repeated, carved on stone, and proclaimed everywhere. Such monuments were placed where no one could miss them, repainted and renewed over time, presenting not only the power of a god, but also the habits of those who served him. Priests naturally promoted the cult that supported them, announcing festivals and attractions through official heralds, as happened at several well-known sanctuaries. Yet none of this amounted to evangelism in the modern sense. It did not aim to reshape lives or demand exclusive loyalty. It assumed belief rather than sought to create it. The message was simple: come for healing, guidance, or celebration. On roads and in marketplaces, devotees of various gods might beg for offerings, but they did not preach. Organized missionary activity, as a deliberate goal, barely existed in pagan religion. No god demanded it. Priests sometimes encouraged devotion by restoring shrines or building new structures. A few cults had more visible leadership than others. Jupiter Doloshenus stands out for having an active priesthood, especially in frontier regions. Its priests appear frequently in inscriptions, sometimes acting together across wide areas. This may reflect moments of imperial favour or funding, though even here the evidence remains uncertain. The cult's ministers often came from the eastern provinces rather than the local elite. Other foreign cults show similar patterns. Some priests travelled far from their homelands, bringing specialised rituals or sacred languages with them. Yet over time, these cults lost much of their original character. Within a generation or two, they adapted to local customs. This raises an important question. Was there ever a single, unified form of worship for any of these gods? The answer appears to be no. Even the cult of Jupiter, which seems the most standardized, varied widely in practice. His temples followed familiar names and forms, and his worship marked the official calendar in many cities. But local priests often served several gods at once, suggesting limited expertise and loose boundaries between cults. Physical imitation of Roman models existed, but it blended freely with other traditions. Sacred landscapes were copied, statues replicated, calendars aligned, and hymns reused. These details show a sense of shared identity, but not strict control. At the same time, differences were everywhere. Ritual rules varied by region. Practices considered forbidden in one place were normal in another. Cults adapted freely, mixing old and new elements. Some changed dramatically over time. No central authority enforced uniform belief or ritual. Even where state involvement existed, it focused on property, funding, and scheduling, not doctrine. Cities took pride in their gods. They built temples, hosted festivals, and funded facilities to attract visitors. This was civic ambition rather than religious regulation. Wealthy families often assumed long-term responsibility for shrines, expanding or repairing them as fortunes allowed. Such patronage shaped religious life more than any official decree. When emperors favoured certain gods, they did so personally, not as lawgivers of belief. Titles linking gods to imperial power reflected loyalty rather than control. No ruler before Constantine attempted to impose uniform worship. Even the army, despite its discipline, followed no consistent religious program. Soldiers honoured a wide range of gods, often their native ones, regardless of official ceremonies. All this helps explain how conversion worked within pagan society. It was not driven by missionaries or state policy. Initiative lay with individuals. People visited shrines, witnessed signs, and chose to believe or not. Religious structures depended on wealth, and wealth brought influence. Aristocrats who supported cults left visible marks not because they obeyed orders, but because they could. Their belief itself became proof of divine power in the eyes of others. When faith spread across distances, it usually followed movement of people, rather than persuasion. In the Western provinces, new cults arrived mainly through immigrants, slaves, and soldiers. Isis provides a clear example. Her worship in Italy was strongest, where Eastern populations settled, especially in port cities. Most of her devotees were slaves or freed persons or their descendants. The cult remained largely within families. There is little evidence of active recruitment. Epigraphic patterns confirm this. Inscriptions rise and fall in step with broader habits of commemoration, not with religious enthusiasm. Apparent peaks often reflect who was recording belief, not how many believed. When distortions are removed, the growth of Isis in the West nearly disappears. Two cults stand apart. Jupiter Dolichinos gained prominence through close ties to the army, but his popularity was limited in scope and time. Mithraism, however, followed a different path. It had no central homeland and spread quietly across the empire. Its small, enclosed sanctuaries preserved its traces unusually well. Though never dominant, it achieved a wide and lasting presence. The links between Mithraism and the Eastern world are so faint that some scholars have gone as far as to deny them altogether. According to this view, the cult did not migrate from the East, but was instead created at a specific moment by an unknown religious innovator, most likely somewhere along the Danube frontier. When Mithraic worship later appears at Jura on the Euphrates in the 3rd century, it is sometimes explained as a secondary arrival, carried there by soldiers who had learned the cult while serving with Western legions. Whether this explanation is correct remains uncertain. What cannot be denied is that Mithraism seems to vanish entirely from the record for a long stretch of time. Then, in the later 1st century, scattered references appear. Within just a few generations, the cult rises to a level of visibility comparable to well-established religions. This achievement is remarkable. Mithra had no great temple, no homeland to anchor loyalty, no city or people dedicated to proclaiming his power. Yet the cult gained prominence across a vast portion of the empire. The closest parallel is not another god, but a mortal figure. The Oracle of Glykon and its creator, Alexander, offers a striking comparison. Alexander blended elements drawn from philosophy, healing traditions, reverence for serpents, ancient hymns, choral performances, epic poetry, and lunar symbolism into a carefully constructed religious system. The result was something entirely new, yet deeply familiar. It even included secret rites. Similar features were already spreading through older cults by imitation, especially in Greece and Asia Minor. Alexander's success lay in recognizing what pagan religion already shared across the eastern provinces and reshaping it into a single, coherent performance. In the western provinces, fascination with Eastern wisdom was widespread. Egypt was respected, but lands even farther east were thought to possess deeper sacred knowledge. Worshippers expected communal meals, shared reverence, and a god who presided over them. They expected ranks of leadership and levels of initiation. Mithraism provided all of this. For those who sought deeper meaning, it offered complex ideas about the soul's journey back to its distant origin, possibly expressed through hymns during ritual gatherings. The West, however, favoured a different tone. It was less expansive, less verbal, more restrained. Mithraism adapted perfectly. With almost commercial instinct, it combined familiar elements into a powerful whole. In the early 2nd century, it showed an unusual ability to attract converts among the diverse populations of Italy and the western provinces. Unlike earlier cults that spread from a single centre, Mithraism had no clear starting point. It seemed to emerge fully formed, without roots. This remains one of the great puzzles of ancient religion. Many explanations have been proposed. Some have argued that Mithraism flourished because older religions were in decline and people were spiritually weakened by hardship. This view imagines a population seeking comfort and escape in new faiths. Yet such claims rest on vague language and unexamined assumptions. We have almost no access to the inner lives of ancient people, and even less reason to believe that entire centuries shared a single emotional condition. It makes little sense to describe such a long and complex era as though it were uniform in spirit. Doing so flattens history and replaces understanding with slogans. When evidence is scarce, there is a temptation to impose grand theories. But fewer facts do not justify broader conclusions. Another explanation suggests that mystery cults helped people accept social inequality by framing it as part of a cosmic order. In Mithraism, the presence of ranks and degrees has been interpreted as mirroring military or bureaucratic hierarchies. But this explanation is doubtful. People seeking relief from rigid structures are unlikely to recreate them in their leisure. The appeal of Mithraism lay elsewhere. It lay in shared experience. Worshippers gathered to eat and drink together, preparing food in public spaces before descending into dark sanctuaries. Inside, they reclined in the presence of the god, surrounded by flickering light and ritual objects. Wine flowed freely, prayers were spoken together, perhaps hymns were sung. At certain moments, the priest may have spoken of the god's gifts, and the soul's ascent to a higher realm. We cannot know how often or in what form these teachings were delivered, but such elements were clearly part of the cult. Modern observers often imagine Mithraism as rigidly hierarchical because of its graded initiations. In reality, the number and structure of ranks varied widely. Some communities had many levels, others only a few. There is no evidence that these ranks created a fixed sense of status. Other religious and even secular associations of the time also used ranks, titles, and structured banquets. These practices were common social tools, not unique spiritual markers. If Mithraism promised immortality, its followers showed little urgency in claiming it. Surviving greetings celebrate long life, rather than imminent salvation. Christian critics do not accuse Mithraists of false hopes of eternal life, which is striking. It suggests that Mithraic beliefs about the afterlife were no clearer or more compelling than those of other pagan cults. What does stand out unmistakably is the physical setting of Mithraic worship. Most sanctuaries were underground, and their design was deliberate. Excavations reveal benches for communal meals, painted walls, and ritual spaces shaped to produce dramatic effects. Light entered through carefully placed openings, illuminating key moments or symbols. Decorative elements sparkled in the darkness. Some reliefs were designed to rotate, revealing sudden images. Curtains could be raised to expose sacred scenes. Altars were carved to allow hidden lamps to glow through glass or stone. In one sanctuary, even a theatrical sword was found, designed to create the illusion of a mortal wound, without injury. Darkness itself was part of the experience. Underground spaces evoked death, mystery, and the presence of unseen powers. The gloom heightened emotion and expectation. Ancient writers note that fear and awe were deliberately cultivated. Whatever doctrines were taught, whatever debates surround Mithraic meals or beliefs, one fact is clear: these rites were designed to astonish. No other cult employed spectacle so consistently. Some used darkness, narrow passages, and torchlight to inspire awe, but none matched the theatrical precision of Mithraism. Contemporary writers frequently speak of religious trickery, and it would be surprising if Mithraism avoided it. Showmanship was part of its success. This does not mean the priests were insincere. Faith and illusion often coexist. Symbols may have carried philosophical meanings drawn from astrology or theology, accessible to the educated and the unlettered alike. The same ritual could speak to a clerk and a labourer. What mattered was visible power. That is the key to conversion. People believed when they saw divinity at work. Everything else followed. This explains the spread of Mithraism and perhaps that of Jupiter Dolichanos as well. These were the only cults that clearly drew new adherents in significant numbers, at least for a time. Their success has often been taken as proof that older gods had lost their hold, but this assumes a false unity among so-called Eastern religions. In reality, these cults were as different from one another as they were from traditional Greco-Roman worship. The idea of a single Eastern religious movement collapses on inspection. Nor is it convincing to place the peak of these cults around the year 300. Before that time, emperors emphasized the sun. Afterward, they did so again. In between, the ruling system emphasized Jupiter and Hercules, symbols deeply rooted in Roman tradition. Coinage from this period reflects continuity, not decline. When gods disappear from coins, it reflects artistic or administrative choices, not loss of faith. Claims that paganism was nearing collapse rely heavily on declining inscriptions. But inscriptions reflect habits of record keeping, not belief. When stonecutters fall silent, it does not mean worship has ended. The surviving record rises and falls with wealth, stability, and custom. Across the empire, written evidence fades unevenly. Some regions fall silent earlier than others. The reasons remain unclear. Poverty alone cannot explain it, nor can political unrest. Different regions experience different conditions, yet show similar gaps. What can be said is this: when records begin to recover, it is not paganism that re-emerges most visibly, but Christianity. At the same time, Christians found it easier to produce inscriptions. Their religious life required less material investment. Pagan worship, by contrast, depended heavily on wealth. Temples, festivals, sacrifices, and public feasts were expensive. As resources dwindled, these visible forms declined. This does not mean paganism lacked value. Worship could take many forms: eating, singing, dancing, building, writing. Pagan religion thrived in good times and returned to grandeur under later emperors. But when money became scarce, fewer people could sustain its public expressions. In response, older local traditions resurfaced. Small-scale worship, tied to land and community, required little support. These local gods had survived beneath imperial religions centuries. In difficult times, they proved resilient. Such cults lay beyond the reach of broad historical analysis. They were local, oral, and deeply rooted. When conditions improved again, they remained. But by then, the story of the empire had changed, and it is at that turning point that this account must come to an end.